Today, our focus is James J. Gibson's 1968 book, The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems. It's quite a foundational text.
Absolutely. A really significant one.
Our mission, then, is to understand Gibson's perspective, how he saw our senses not just as isolated channels, but as these integrated, active systems for perceiving the world.
And Gibson, he wasn't just describing things. He was tackling some big questions in the book, like what's innate versus what we learn in perception.
Right, the classic nature versus nurture debate in this context.
Yeah, and the role of learning itself, how expectation shapes what we perceive, the influence of language, even why we experience illusions.
So he was really challenging the status quo of perceptual psychology at the time.
Very much so. He aimed to dismantle these time-worn ideas about the senses.
Yeah.
And he grounded his arguments in evolutionary principles and a lot of experimental evidence. It's quite rigorous.
We'll be focusing on the theoretical underpinnings and the experimental side of Gibson's arguments.
Agreed. It's necessary given the source material.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What are the fundamental premises of Gibson's theory? Where does he begin?
Well, right at the heart of it, Gibson makes a pretty bold claim. He says that sensations, the raw feelings of light, sound, touch, we often think of as the building blocks of perception.
Yeah.
He argues they're actually just fleeting side effects, kind of accompaniments.
Side effects, not the main event.
Not the main event. For Gibson, perception is fundamentally about detecting information that's already out there, present in the environment.
Okay, so it shifts the focus from internal feelings to external information.
And he sees the sense organs, eyes, ears, skin, not as passive receivers of energy, but as active channels, tools the organism uses to obtain that environmental information.
Active channels. So they're more like explorers than receptacles.
That's a great way to put it. He talks about coordinated systems or apparatuses designed for both passive registration and active seeking of information. This leads him to propose 5 main perceptual systems.
And these aren't just the traditional 5 senses repackaged?
Not exactly. They correspond loosely. But the emphasis is on integrated function, not isolated modalities. It's about how these systems work together to get information.
Interesting. So integrated goal-directed systems. You mentioned information versus energy. That sounds like a critical distinction for him. Can you unpack that?
It's absolutely pivotal. Gibson draws a sharp line between stimulus energy, the physical stuff like light waves or sound pressure that hits our receptors,
Stuff we can measure, like intensity or frequency.
and stimulus information. This is what the perceptual systems are tuned to. Information is about structure, patterns, relationships within that energy that correspond directly to things in the world. It's much more complex and specific than just energy levels.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this. The light photons hitting my retina are energy, but the pattern in that light that tells me that's a tree over there, that's the information.
That's a perfect analogy, yes. And building on that, he talks about 2 levels of sensitivity. You've got the passive receptors, photoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, which have measurable thresholds, a minimum energy needed to fire.
Right.
But then you have the active perceptual organs or systems, like the whole visual system, working together. He argues these don't have fixed thresholds in the same way. Their sensitivity depends on the information they're extracting, which relies on those underlying receptors, of course.
Understood. So it's not just about did the receptor fire, but did the system pick up meaningful information? This seems to lead naturally to his next big point, starting perception research by asking, what is there to be perceived?
He insists we have to begin with the environment, the shared world that humans and animals inhabit. That's where the information originates.
So understand the source before you understand the detection.
He points to all the different kinds of ambient or surrounding information available. There's the basic layout of surfaces, the ground, walls, objects, the fundamental structure of our physical world.
The geometry of the place we're in.
Correct. But also information from mechanical events, vibrations, sounds. Information from chemical events, think diffusion fields, creating smells and tastes. And information from contact mechanics, forces, textures, deformations when we touch things.
And the key idea is that these aren't just random occurrences. They carry information about their sources.
Yes, inherently. The specific way a sound wave vibrates tells you something objective about the event that caused it. A certain chemical signature in the air isn't just a smell. It reliably specifies its source.
Like his examples, smoke means fire. A particular musky smell means a skunk nearby.
The information is specific to the source. He also brings in the idea of the animate environment social stimulation. Things like releasers, which are specific patterns that trigger innate responses, or signals specifying things like infancy or parenthood.
Which makes evolutionary sense: quick, reliable cues for survival and social interaction.
Definitely. And then critically, he looks at how humans have changed the environment and the sources of stimulation.
Through artifacts, tools.
Yes, and harnessing fire, developing language and representation. He traces this progression from speaking and hearing to making images to writing and reading.
And language has a huge impact on learning and, what did he call it, secondhand perception.
Yes, secondhand perception. It's about gaining knowledge about things we haven't directly experienced ourselves, but learn about through descriptions, pictures, texts.
So reading about lions in Africa gives me a kind of perception, even though I'm not there.
That's the idea. But he stresses that while stimuli specify their source, they aren't the same thing as the source. And whether we pick up that information depends on us, our attention, our actions, our prior knowledge.
So seeing a photo of a cat isn't the same as seeing the cat, but it carries information about the cat, and understanding that depends on me knowing what cats and photos are.
And Gibson ties all this back to ecology. He sees ecology as this unifying field bringing together physics, geology, biology, even archaeology and anthropology, all focused on that fundamental question. What can stimulate a sentient organism?
That's a very holistic view, grounding perception firmly in the organism's relationship with its environment. Now let's shift to an area where he really challenged traditional thinking. Proprioception, our sense of body position and movement. He wasn't keen on the standard classifications, was he?
No, he critiqued Charrington's classic division into exteroceptors, external world, proprioceptors, body position movement, and interoceptors, internal organs. Gibson argued that the key isn't where the receptor is located anatomically.
What is it then?
It's the interplay, the mixing of stimulation caused by external events and stimulation caused by the organism's own activity. That's the crucial distinction for understanding perceptual systems.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about maintaining balance. You're using muscle tension, right? Anti-gravity muscles are constantly working. This relies on stretch receptors within those muscles traditionally classed as proprioceptors. But Gibson sees this not just as isolated proprioception, but as part of a continuous active process of compensating and maintaining equilibrium, integrating information from multiple sources.
So the feeling of effort in my legs isn't just a muscle sense, it's part of the larger system keeping me upright, informed by gravity, the ground, and internal feedback.
He describes this hierarchy of stability. The ground supports the legs support the body supports the head, which needs to be a stable platform for the eyes, ears, and nose. And he adds that the gravity receptors in the inner ear also feed into this, influencing muscle tone and balance.
This perspective might also help explain things like, why don't we feel like the world is spinning when we move our eyes rapidly, even though the image is technically sweeping across our retina?
That's a classic puzzle. Gibson suggests that stimulation arising from our own actions, like voluntary eye movements, is different from stimulation caused by external motion. He talks about a natural stimulus for proprioception, or maybe self-perception, having both adjacent order, spatial structure, and successive order, change over time. It contains both change and non-change components.
So the brain isn't just registering the retinal slip, it's factoring in the "I commanded that movement" signal.
That's the essence of it, yes. He goes further, questioning the whole idea of sense organs as just mosaics of tiny transducers, each with its own private line to a specific brain cell. He points out that receptive fields overlap significantly.
Like on the skin, one point stimulates multiple nerve endings.
Right. And he notes the lack of a neat one-to-one mapping between nerves and senses. There isn't one nerve just for taste or just for touch. Cranial and spinal nerves often carry mixed signals.
So he's pushing for a more integrated, less compartmentalized view of how sensory input is processed.
Very much so. While he acknowledges the basic transducers, mechanoreceptors for pressure vibration, chemoreceptors for chemicals, photoreceptors for light, he stresses these are just the starting point. They feed into these larger, more complex perceptual systems.
Okay, which brings us squarely to his proposed 5 perceptual systems. Can you list them again?
Yes. He outlines the visual system, the auditory system, the haptic system, which is basically touch and body sense, combined the taste-smell system, and the basic orienting system.
And a key feature is the difference between just passively having senses and actively using them.
Absolutely. He distinguishes passive sensory capacity, the basic ability of our receptors to respond, from active attention. Active attention involves exploratory movements, like turning your head to listen or moving your eyes to look. investigatory responses, as Pavlov called them.
And crucially, these systems can learn. They get better with practice.
Yes, that's a major point. Perceptual systems are adaptable, trainable. We can improve our ability to discriminate details, which contrasts with the old idea that basic sensations are innate and fixed.
That fits experience, doesn't it? Musicians develop finer auditory discrimination, artists finer visual discrimination. Okay, let's briefly touch on each system. The basic orienting system first.
This system is centered in the inner ear. It picks up forces of acceleration, telling us about gravity, which way is down, and about our own body movements. Interestingly, its input often coverage with touch input from the haptic system, working together for orientation.
And the auditory system.
The ears, primarily, specialized for two main jobs: locating sound sources, using input from both ears, and identifying the event that made the sound by analyzing its temporal pattern and frequency content. Gibson also notes the evolution of the middle ear in land animals as key for hearing airborne sound.
Then the haptic system, you said it's more than just touch.
Much more. It involves the whole body, the skin, and our limbs acting as active perceptual tools. It combines input from skin, joints, muscles, all working together, their inputs kazooieing to specify the world immediately around us, the things we can reach and interact with.
So feeling an object involves skin pressure, but also joint angles, muscle tension.
All integrated. Then there's the taste-smell system.
Reacting to chemicals in the environment.
Right. The mouth and nose. The mouth is involved in exploring substances directly, while the nose allows perception of sources further away via airborne chemicals.
And finally, the visual system, which he had a lot to say about, challenging traditional views.
He certainly did. He saw the eyes as actively detecting variables in the light itself. Things like contours, textures, color patterns, motion. He really moved away from the simple idea of the eye as just a camera forming a picture on the retina.
It's a powerful reframing. And he also talked about the partial equivalence of these systems. What does that mean?
It means different systems can sometimes pick up the same information about the environment. For example, you might see the shape of an object, but you could also feel its shape with your hands. You get the same information about the shape through different systems,
Leading to the same perception, even if the raw sensations feel different.
It makes perception more robust because the information is often redundant across systems. For Gibson, the real problem of perception isn't sticking little sensations together. It's discriminating the relevant information from the constant flow of stimulation.
That's a fundamental shift. Okay, let's dive deeper into some of these systems. How about the basic orienting system, the statocist and vestibular organs?
Right. So in simpler animals, you find the statocist. It's basically a little sac with hair cells and a dense particle inside, a statolith. Gravity pulls the statolith down, stimulating different hair cells depending on how the animal is tilted.
A simple down detector.
Pretty much. It gives a basic sense of orientation relative to gravity and triggers motor responses to correct tilt. In vertebrates, this evolved into the more complex vestibular system in the inner ear. The key addition there was the semicircular canals.
What do they add?
They allow the system to distinguish rotations from linear movements or translations. So you have the maculae and the utricle and saccule, still sensing gravity and linear acceleration, and then the cupullae in the semicircular canals, which detect head rotations.
Giving us a much more sophisticated sense of 3D movement and orientation.
Absolutely. It's crucial for balance, posture, and distinguishing self-motion, like when we actively start walking from being passively moved, like being pushed. Gibson notes it's really tuned for detecting starts and stops in active movement.
Which is why we can feel acceleration in a car, but not necessarily constant speed.
It's not great at detecting constant velocity when we're being passively transported, which can lead to illusions. So Gibson sees postural orientation as this evolutionary continuum, from simple gravity detection to our complex system, all about registering how our body, particularly the bones, are oriented relative to gravity and the ground.
And the head's orientation provides that stable platform for the other senses we mentioned.
Right. It stabilizes the viewpoint for the eyes, the listening direction for the ears. Geographical orientation, knowing where we are in a larger space, he saw as emerging from the cooperation of multiple systems, not just the vestibular.
Okay, let's move to the auditory system. How does Gibson conceptualize hearing?
Well, he again emphasizes the active nature. The earhead system turns to orient towards a sound source. This helps in localization. But identifying what the sound is comes from analyzing the wave train itself, its pattern over time, and its frequency makeup.
So localization and identification are somewhat separate processes, using different aspects of the sound and our actions.
Yes. And he points out that even with multiple sounds happening at once, we can selectively listen to one, likely aided by this auditory orientation. Many lab experiments on sound localization create illusions, he argues, precisely because they restrict these natural exploratory head movements.
So, letting people move naturally gives more accurate perception. How does he view speech perception? That seems like a special case.
It is. He describes how our vocal apparatus, lungs, larynx, mouth movements produces this complex, structured sound stream. We segment this stream into vowels and consonants, or phones.
The basic sound units of language.
Right. And Gibson argues the information for a phone isn't just a simple pitch or loudness. It's relational. It's an invariant pattern that stays recognizable even if the speaker's voice is high or low, loud or soft, fast or slow.
So the P sound has a characteristic acoustic signature, a pattern that's consistent across different speakers and contexts.
That's the idea. He even suggests these phonemic patterns have a kind of reality in the air as higher-order structures in the sound waves. And importantly, hearing speech is both extraceptive hearing others and proprioceptive,
Proprioceptive. How so?
because speakers hear their own voices through a vocal auditory feedback loop. We monitor our own speech as we produce it. This whole system facilitates communication and the shared sound patterns that define a linguistic community.
A really integrated view of speaking and listening. Now, the haptic system perception through touch and body movement, you said it's more than the sum of its parts.
Definitely. Gibson defined it as sensing the adjacent world by essentially laying hold of it with the body. He strongly objected to breaking it down into supposed elementary sensations like pressure, warmth, cold, pain, and kinesthesis, like some early psychologists tried to do.
So what is it then, in his view?
It's the whole body as a perceptual system. The skin, yes, but also the limbs, the joints, all working together. Our extremities are both sensory explorers and motor tools. The sensitivity of the joints, telling us where our limbs are, is absolutely crucial.
And this system gives us quite rich information.
Surprisingly rich.
Yeah.
We can perceive object shape, for instance, by exploring with our hands. Gibson talks about registering the directions and spans of the finger's bone space, he called it. Critically, you perceive the object's constant shape, not the changing pattern of pressure on your moving skin.
So the system extracts the invariant object property from the varying stimulation.
And then there's dynamic touching, actively manipulating an object, squeezing, lifting, rubbing. This lets us perceive material properties like texture, weight, consistency, even temperature.
How does temperature perception work in this view?
He saw it as registering the rate of heat flow whether your body is gaining or losing heat to the object. It's directly linked to thermal regulation. Cold, he said, isn't just a sensation. It's a biophysical reality for an organism needing to maintain its temperature.
And pain.
Related to specifying potential or actual tissue damage, though he acknowledged the correlation isn't perfect. He also touched on social touch, referencing Harlow's work with monkeys to show the fundamental need for contact comfort, beyond just food and warmth.
So the haptic system gives us geometry from joints, material properties from dynamic touch, thermal information, alerts to damage, even social connection. It's incredibly versatile.
Extremely. Far more than just a list of separate skin senses. Okay, how about the taste-smell system, chemical senses?
Right. Again, he stresses information over energy. An odor specifies a source, but it isn't chemically identical to the source itself.
Correct. And tasting involves integrating multiple cues from a substance, modulated by mouth movements exploring, preparing to swallow. He notes taste isn't a foolproof guide to nutrition, though. We can be fooled by harmful things that taste good or reject beneficial things.
What about hunger and thirst? Are they part of this system?
He distinguishes physiological hunger as a more general bodily need. Thirst can be detected by dryness in the mouth, but also, intriguingly, directly by nerve centers in the brain monitoring blood composition. He also points out the mouth is used for exploring objects, especially by infants, suggesting it's acting as a perceptual system beyond just eating, and of course for vocalizing and social contact. You can even identify shapes placed in your mouth without seeing them.
That's right. That links back to the haptic idea, too. And smell, or olfaction.
Odors objectively specify things like plants and animals. But whether we find an odor attractive or repulsive depends on our own biological needs and history, what Gibson called their affordances. Environmental odors are usually complex mixtures, not pure chemicals.
And we still don't fully understand the basic taste categories, like sweet or sour.
The exact chemical triggers and mechanisms remain a bit mysterious, he notes. With smell, the nose acts alongside breathing, allowing us to perceive distant sources, even track where animals have been from lingering scent trails. This depends on odors being specific to their sources, which is partly innate, partly learned.
And orienting to a smell source isn't just following a chemical gradient.
No, it's about discriminating the information or value in the substance, not just its concentration. How we detect these chemical values is tricky, but one idea is that the information lies in the profile, the relative proportions of different molecules in the mixture.
Complex stuff. Okay, let's tackle the big one, the visual system. Gibson's ecological optics.
Right. His starting point is that vision evolved to exploit the information available in ambient light, the light that surrounds us. He talks about the two main eye types, compound and chambered, likely evolving from simple light-sensitive spots.
And he argued you don't necessarily need a perfect camera-like image for useful vision.
Just registering differences in light from different directions, like a compound eye does, is enough for many basic tasks. He identified three core visual tasks: detecting the layout of the environment, detecting changes, like movement, and detecting and controlling our own locomotion.
Even simple organisms can manage basic orientation, like telling sky from ground.
Yes, based on the invariant pattern of light being generally brighter above than below, that's a response to an array difference, not just overall brightness. This requires stabilizing the eye relative to the light array, hence compensatory eye movements.
Then came lenses, focused images, retinas.
Yes, improving detail. Binocular vision added redundancy and depth perception from disparity. Foveas evolved for high acuity, allowing pursuit movements to track objects, and saccades to jump between points of interest. Retina specialized for day or night vision, or both. Color vision likely came with cone systems, adding information about surface textures and pigments.
But the core idea remains. Eyes register differences in light from different directions, and the nervous system interprets the structure in that light.
Precisely. The key question is there structure in ambient light that carries information? This leads to his ecological optics.
Which looks at light in the natural environment, not just in a physics lab.
Terrestrial light is complex. Diffuse light from the sky, structured light reflected off surfaces below. This creates the optic array, the pattern of light converging at any potential point of observation. It's full of texture gradients due to perspective. Every viewpoint has a unique optic array because of the surrounding layout.
So the light arriving at my eye is already structured by the environment it reflected off.
Yes. He describes stages: illumination, reflection off surfaces, the resulting ambient array structured by surface shapes, reflectance, shadows, and finally the portion of that array admitted by the eye.
And when we move, this array changes systematically.
Right, creating optical flow. This flow provides incredibly reliable information about our own movement, visual kinesthesis. The point from which the flow expands tells you your direction of heading. Total flow signals self-motion, whereas partial flow signals object motion.
He also talked about occlusion.
Yes, kinetic optical occlusion. As you move, or an object moves, the edge of a nearer surface progressively covers and uncovers the texture of a farther surface. This wiping and shearing of texture powerfully specifies depth at an edge. He called this a modal perception. You perceive the edge without a specific sensation of the edge itself. Attached shadows also structure the light, revealing surface shape relative to the light source.
So layout, surfaces, shadows, reflectance, they all structure the light together.
They're all interdependent in the optic array and in our perception. And he argued we should analyze perception starting with textured surfaces, not abstract points of light. He even endorsed Raunchy's idea that optics should be the science of vision.
A radical rethinking of optics itself. Now, how does this relate to human-made structuring of light, like pictures and writing?
He sees images, or representative displays, as surfaces structured to provide information similar to what you get from another part of the environment. They allow for mediated or secondhand perception.
Like seeing a picture of the Grand Canyon gives you some of the structural information you'd get if you were actually there.
Some of it, yes. He contrasts this with non-representational displays, where meaning is arbitrary. He talks about the act of drawing or marking a surface as fundamental. The proprioception of the hand movement leads to the perception of the resulting trace. Pictures, from cave paintings on, allow communication across time and space. Perspective was developed to enhance this realism, while Impressionists focused on painting the light itself.
But a picture is always a bit paradoxical, isn't it? It's a flat object and it depicts something else.
Exactly. It conveys information about both its own surface and what it represents. Gibson suggests this leads to a pictorial attitude, a kind of self-consciousness about perception, maybe even noticing sensations more. He clarifies that the structure of the optic array, lines, textures, gradients, is distinct from its physical causes.
And writing.
He saw alphabetic writing as a way to freeze speech sounds into visual traces, combining the flexibility of speech with the permanence of records. He distinguishes information about something, leading to perception of it, from information as structure, allowing perception as discrimination. Static pictures can sometimes carry ambiguous information, think reversible figures or impossible objects, but his core hypothesis holds. The same structural information variables in the array should yield the same perception. The optic array surrounds us boundaryless, while the retina samples it bit by bit.
Which leads to how we actually pick up this information scanning and attention.
Right. Our eyes don't just passively receive, they actively scan with fixations and saccades. Think about reading that's a learned scanning pattern. Ecological optics helps understand why we move our eyes the way we do to pick up information from the ambient optic array.
So the array is the whole potential view, and our eye movements sample parts of it.
He challenged the idea of a stable, inverted retinal image being the thing we perceive. The optic array is more primary. Our body, head, and eyes explore, creating transformations in the array. Locomotion itself is exploration, building up a cognitive map, not from static images, but from experienced transformations.
And attention isn't just a mental spotlight, but an active tuning of the perceptual systems.
Yes, actively directing the receptors to pick up invariants, driven by curiosity and what the environment affords its potential uses or meanings for us. This tuning depends on experience, but not necessarily on retrieving specific memories. He critiques the idea of the brain enriching poor sensory input with memories.
Why? What's his alternative?
He argues the input isn't necessarily impoverished if you consider the richness of the optic array in active exploration.
Yeah.
He also dismisses the problem of the blind spot we don't see a hole, because there's no information specifying a hole coming from that spot during active scanning. Scanning helps isolate information about permanent features, reducing the need to constantly remember everything.
So perception, memory, expectation, they're all intertwined, not separate stages.
Very much so. Perceptual learning, for him, is about tuning the system to invariance, becoming better at discriminating critical features. It's like a radio tuning itself to a station. Information pickup reinforces the tuning. Associative learning, Pavlov, Skinner, is just detecting invariance in specific, often artificial situations. Insight learning, Kohler, is suddenly detecting useful relationships, affordances, through interaction.
And judging same or different isn't a comparison against a memory trace.
No, it reflects the tuning of the system. Is it sensitive to this difference or not? He liked Tolman's idea of learning as forming and confirming expectations, not just reinforcing responses. Anticipating the future, like catching a ball, relies on detecting lawful invariance in the flow of stimulation.
And language helps us codify and share these perceived facts, educating our attention.
Precisely. So perceptual development involves differentiating inputs within a system, linking inputs between systems like vision and touch, and learning the affordances of things and the invariance in events.
That's a comprehensive view of active perception and learning. But what about when perception goes wrong? Errors, illusions.
A good theory has to account for failures too. He distinguishes between situations where the information itself is inadequate or misleading, and cases where adequate information is there, but the observer fails to pick it up.
Examples of naturally inadequate information.
The classic bent stick in water refraction misleads. Mirages. Sometimes mechanical stimuli can mislead too, like a powerful water jet feeling solid. Also, stimuli below receptor thresholds simply aren't detected, though the absence of expected sound or touch can be informative. Information can also be effectively non-existent if it's perfectly camouflaged, lost in noise.
What about artificial situations?
Lab setups like tachystoscopes flashing images briefly limit pickup time. Restricting vision to the periphery limits detail. Wearing distorting glasses, like Stratton did, deforms the information. Adaptation happens as the person learns to correlate their actions with the new, distorted sensory consequences.
And illusions like after effects.
Motion after effects. Figural after effects. These result from prolonged stimulation adapting specific neural channels. The cold-warm hand illusion depends on the direction of heat flow. Artificial illusions often come from representations. A mirror image looks real because it provides equivalent structural information to the real object.
What about ambiguous figures or geometrical illusions?
Ambiguous figures, like figure ground reversals, arise from contradictory information in the picture. Geometrical illusions, Mueller-Lyer, etc., he suspected weren't purely subjective errors, but may be related to how our visual system interprets 2D cues that normally specify 3D size and distance. He also includes simple after sensations, bright light after image, and failures due to overselective attention.
So a range of causes for perceptual failure.
Yes. And he concludes by noting that even realistic media like movies are illusions because while the visual and auditory information might be rich, the proprioceptive feedback corresponding to moving within that depicted world is missing. You're passively observing.
A fascinating distinction. Okay, to wrap this up, what are the absolute key takeaways from Gibson?
Well, fundamentally, perception is active detection of information, not passive reception of sensations. The structure of the environment and the structure of ambient energy fields like light and sound is paramount. Perceptual systems are exploratory and learn through interaction.
And representations like pictures and language are powerful tools for secondhand perception, but they rely on codes and discrimination, not just simple association. Learning is about educating attention.
Exactly. It's about becoming better attuned to the meaningful information already present in the world.
This has been incredibly insightful. Gibson's ideas really challenge you to think differently about everyday experience. Building on his work, it makes you wonder.
What's that?
Well, with our increasing immersion in mediated experiences screens, VR, AR, could this constant diet of secondhand, often artificial stimuli be subtly changing how we learn to perceive the direct environment? Does it affect the education of attention he talked about?
That's a really provocative thought.
Yeah.
If perception develops through active engagement with rich, natural information, what happens when more of our engagement is with simplified, curated, or even illusory information structures?
Right. It raises some deep questions about perceptual development and maybe even what it means to know something in a world increasingly shaped by these artificial stimuli. Something for you, the listener, to definitely ponder.
Indeed. The implications of Gibson's framework seem more relevant than ever in our current technological landscape.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.